Hello, and thank you so much for tuning in today. My name is Andrew Phillips, and I'm the curator here at the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library in Stanton, Virginia. We appreciate you joining us for today's special program, all about a very special item that we have in our collection here in Stanton. We have been here in this city since the 1930s, but even before what becomes the Presidential Library was formally established in 1938, a very special item was donated to us. In fact, in 1925, when there was still a family living in the Woodrow Wilson birthplace, this item became the very beginning of our now extensive object and artifact collections. And we've picked a very auspicious day to talk about it. So let's dive in. In 1925, the city of Stanton received a very special gift. Woodrow Wilson had passed away just the year before, and the native son of the small Virginia town had been a particular enthusiast of automobiles. One of his favorites was a 1919 Pierce Arrow limousine. Today, it is the oldest still operational car in the country, and pictured here in front of the Wilson birthplace, it has been here in this city since 1925, donated by his widow, Edith, just the year after his death. Now, Woodrow Wilson was not the very first president to ride in or have cars as a part of the White House fleet. His immediate predecessor, William Howard Taft, was the very first to have them in the fleet. But Theodore Roosevelt, the president before Taft, was the first U.S. president to ride in an automobile during his presidency. And Pierce Arrow was one of the most famous luxury brands in the United States at that time. Despite being a luxury brand, that certainly didn't stop it from using presidential attention in its advertisements, including this one from an ad in 1916. You can see perhaps the quality of copy and paste of Photoshop, perhaps, from 1916. Now, the Pierce Arrow Company had a long history well before it started making luxury automobiles for the U.S. government. It began in Buffalo, New York, and its factory and headquarters are still there today, despite the company not lasting through the Depression. The Pierce Arrow Company was founded in 1865 as the Pierce Company, no arrow yet, and they mostly made household items. In fact, they were especially famous for their very elaborate metal bird cages. In 1896, they moved into the transportation sector and started making bicycles. And in 1901, they made their very first automobile. It was a two-speed single-cylinder automobile, and they called it the Motorette. It was intended to be easy to use, though it, compared especially to today, certainly didn't go very fast. Now, the Pierce Company continued to create automobiles in the early 1900s, and in 1905, they entered a car they called the Great Arrow into the Glidden Tour. This was an endurance race, about 350 miles of road race from New York City to Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The winner, like with most races, was the first to cross the finish line there in New Hampshire, but this was not really a speed race. This was an endurance race. Different automobile companies were competing to show that, yes, their car could stand up to the rigors of such a journey. There were some roads that were paved, others that were dirt, or if the weather was not cooperating, mud. There were streams to ford. This was not just a jaunt up a modern interstate. And so the winners of these races, which occurred every year, got significant bragging rights to show that their car was sturdy enough to handle the challenges that a motorist of the day could expect to encounter. When the Great Arrow won the race in 1905, it was so famous that they changed the name of the company. That's when it became Pierce Arrow. It would be a little bit like if Ford decided to change their name and became the Ford Mustang Company, or Chevy, I guess, became the Chevrolet Tahoe Company, something like that. It also became really helped to make its name and became more famous. One of the go-to cars for the upper level of American society, indeed international society, but we'll get to them in a little bit. But they were moving into the luxury market without spending much time at the lower ends of the market. Unlike Ford with the Model T, this was not an automobile that was intended to be mass produced and available to anyone. The Pierce era was moving explicitly into the luxury car market. And they were so successful in this effort that the very first official cars ordered by the White House for a presidential fleet, which before then had been all horses and carriages, occurs in 1909 when William Howard Taft orders 2 cars that were both Pierce Arrows. We'll jump forward in history a little bit now and talk more about this car, the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library's Pierce Arrow. Woodrow Wilson first rides in it on July 9th, 1919. And that is the date that we celebrate as the car's birthday every year. It was made in June earlier that year, but we're not sure of the exact date. And it's a little more fun, we think, to choose the day where Wilson first made it his presidential limousine. On that date, in July of 1919, Wilson was returning from France. He had been in Europe for almost 6 months in total, leaving for the first leg, his first jaunt there in December of 1918, almost immediately after the end of World War I. He was there primarily in Paris, negotiating the end of that war, and the Treaty of Versailles, as well as a number of others, comes from those meetings. When the Treaty of Versailles is signed at the end of June 1919, Wilson returns to the United States. He sails on the SS George Washington, comes into Newark Harbor, and then takes a train down to Washington, D.C. He arrives at Union Station in D.C., not too far from the White House, a little after midnight. And though it was midnight, unfortunately, we don't have an image of that return, but there were more than 100,000 people there to meet him. And that is the very first time that he steps into and takes a ride in this 1919 Pierce Arrow limousine. While we don't have a photograph of that particular night, we do have another one, this one from late September of 1919, in which outside of Union Station, Woodrow Wilson has just hopped back in to that very same Pierce Arrow after returning from a train trip around the Western United States. Now, this particular Pierce Arrow was a Series 51 vestibule limousine. It was intended to be driven by a chauffeur and was one of the very first cars that the Pierce Arrow Company makes after it resumes civilian production following the end of World War I. For much of the war, starting especially in 1916 and 17, the vast majority of American industry was focused on supplying the war effort. Before the United States joins the war, they are primarily trying to sell to the French and the British because they're the ones who have access to American markets. The Germans are fairly effectively blockaded. But when the United States joins the war in April of 1917, pretty much all of U.S. industry goes into high gear, producing for the war. And Pierce Arrow was no exception. They produced thousands and thousands of trucks like the one you see here that were used especially on the Western Front. In fact, pieces of those cars continue to crop up every spring. It's sometimes called the Iron Harvest. It's when farmers in northeastern France and western Belgium plow their fields. They still find metal pieces from automobiles, from weaponry, from the trenches, even sometimes unexploded ordnance that has to be taken care of by their respective militaries. but they still turn up there along the former line of the Western Front in World War I. Now, this car, though, when they have returned to civilian production, this Pierce Arrow limousine was the top of the line in 1919. At a time when a Model T cost $350, this Pierce Arrow costs $9,250. It was leased by the U.S. Government, so it was never actually owned by the government, but was leased to be a part of the White House fleet. And you may be a bit confused, saying the car you've shown me in the pictures so far, it's got a top. Why are you showing me this image of a convertible? But actually, this car was unique in that it had two separate bodies. This body that you see here is the touring body. And every year, or I should say twice a year, first in the spring and then in the fall, the car would be driven back up to the factory in Buffalo, New York, to have the bodies switched. So during the winter, it would be an enclosed space. During the spring and summer, it would be open. Unfortunately, we no longer have the open body of the car, and so it is nowadays it is a enclosed vestibule style all the time. Now, the presidential features of this car were almost entirely cosmetic. The car does not have the modern sort of protections that we think of when we talk about presidential limousines today. I believe, in fact, that the modern day presidential limousine in its trunk always has some of the president's blood type with it in the case of truly extreme emergencies. This one certainly did not have that. I guess didn't really have a trunk at all, now that I think about it. Instead, though, in addition to not having extra blood, it also was not bulletproof. The windows, the doors, nothing about it was meant for explicit protection. Instead, the items that were presidential were entirely decorative. There were flags that were sometimes put on the front fender. The hood ornament of the car, as you can see, was an eagle with the Union shield on its chest. There was also the presidential seal holding the arrows and the olive leaves on either passenger door on the body of the car. And you can see here, this is the seal as it appeared in World War I. It is a common mistake that's the idea that during wartime, the eagle's head faces the arrows, and during peace, it faces the olive leaves. That is not true. In fact, the presidential seal, the eagle always faces one way, but in our history, it has been switched 2 or 3 times. I believe it is during FDR's presidency that the eagle is switched for the last time to be looking to the left and at the I guess it's right talon that holds the eagle, or excuse me, the olive leaves. Now, the car itself was with that high price tag, not surprising, had a number of modern features and was a very efficient, especially for the time, machine. This is an image of the engine, and it was a 6-cylinder, 48 horsepower engine. It did not use antifreeze. It was water cooled and had to be refreshed fairly often. You also can probably tell that there are 2 spark plugs. There's dual intakes. There's a lot of redundancy built into this engine. That is not a function of power, as we might see in more modern automobiles. It truly was a reliability question. Having more than 1 spark plug on each piston enabled the car to keep moving if it happened to lose one. One of the ways that we were able to care for this car and keep it running today is that we have a copy of the owner's manual. It includes a number of very detailed diagrams of the operations of the car. Back in this era, a chauffeur who would drive an automobile like this one was not just a driver, but was pretty much an all-around mechanic. It would take fairly serious problems for the chauffeur to be unable to address them himself, and having these detailed diagrams certainly helped quite a bit. Now, as I mentioned, this car was driven by a chauffeur, and that's the reason that the wheel is on the wrong side. The steering wheel is on the right, when nowadays it's always on the left. This was a time before the standardization of the wheel of the driver being on the left-hand side. This in this design, and I will say that also it was, I believe, the mid-20s that standardization occurs. This steering wheel, though, being on the right side, makes it so that the chauffeur can sort of look out the window over his shoulder and be able to pull real close to the curb. It's meant to make it a little bit easier for the rich person, the important person, whatever you want to call them, who is in the back, who is about to get in. Unfortunately, because of the arrangement of the wheel, it sort of makes it almost impossible to open that driver's side door. You have to get out on the other side, sort of hurry around to open the door for the person that you are driving. Some more elements of the interior of the car. It does have a clock. It has a speedometer. You are able to judge the pressure in the pressure in the gas tank. But an interesting thing that is not present is that it does not have any sort of gasoline gauge. The one that you can see here that says gasoline here on the side. That is the pressure. That is the pressure in the tank that has to be manually built up each time the car is driven. If you want to know how much gas, though, is in the tank, you have to get out of the car, because that gauge is located on the tank itself. You had to be really careful when driving around that you didn't actually accidentally run out in the middle of the street. Would have been certainly embarrassing if you happened to be carrying the President of the United States. The passenger compartment in the back has a number of fancy features. This is a photograph of it in a much more modern period. A bit hard to tell from the angles, but this is from when the Woodrow Wilson sent the car up to Washington, D.C. for the opening of the new Woodrow Wilson Bridge. That was about 15, 20-ish years ago. And sitting in the car are the current governors, the then current governors of Maryland and Virginia, as well as Senator John Warner of Virginia and the Secretary of Transportation. All got to ride into the car to officially inaugurate that new bridge named after Woodrow Wilson. And an interesting feature of it is that in the back of the car, there is a bench seat that was sort of the permanent seating in the back there. But there are also occupied by Senator Warner and by the Secretary of Transportation, 2 jump seats that fold up into the back of the driver's side, into the back of the driver's seat, that can makes the rear component of the car comfortably seat 5 people. And this car very quickly became Woodrow Wilson's favorite in the White House fleet. It was so beloved by him that it was purchased by a few friends of his after leaving office, and it becomes his personal car. Now, Woodrow Wilson didn't have this car for very long before he had a serious stroke in October of 1919. After that stroke, going for rides in this car were some of the few things that he still enjoyed, that he was still able to do. As an example, Woodrow Wilson was one of the, if not the most prolific golfers during his presidency. He played some 1,200 rounds of golf. But once he had his stroke, he was never able to play again. However, with a little assistance, he was able to get into the back of this car, and he loved going for rides, just sort of tooling around Washington, D.C. and its immediate environs. It is this car that takes Woodrow Wilson to the inauguration of Warren G. Harding. He and Warren Harding are seated in the back of the car on their way to the Capitol. And after that event, it returns to the White House, picks Edith, his wife, up, and they drive away to their new home at S Street in Washington, D.C. Until Barack and Michelle Obama, Woodrow and Edith Wilson were the first presidential couple to stay in Washington, D.C. after leaving the White House. They stay in this home, and this car, the car continues to be their primary mode of transportation. The friends who had bought it for him, they were very lucky. They got it, purchased it from the company. Again, it had been leased to the government, not owned by the government, for just $3,000. So a little bit less than a third of the original sort of retail price. A number of modifications were made to the car at that time. Air shocks were added to the front and rear to make the ride a little bit smoother. There also were a number of decorative features that were changed as well. Both the flags and the seal on the back were replaced, were removed. The seals on the doors were replaced by a monogram WW, and the eagle hood ornament was replaced by a snarling Princeton tiger. We can talk for a bit about the lovely orange pinstriping. That was another nod to Princeton that was added while Woodrow Wilson while he was a private citizen. So while the car never looked exactly like this in its history, this is how we maintain it. We like to maintain the presidential insignia, and honestly, the orange pinstriping is just a really cool feature, and we want to keep it looking nice. Now, while in DC, the Pierce Arrow was not the only car that Wilson had, but it was his primary one. It would take him to trips to the theater. He loved just taking drives up to Rock Creek Park or over into Virginia, down to Mount Vernon, through Arlington Heights, just sort of taking daily drives through the city. Woodrow Wilson, I will also say, we have no evidence he ever had a driver's license. He loved the car. He loved going for drives, but he was always driven by his chauffeur. One of my favorite stories about Wilson's outings in this car during his time as a private citizen has to do with baseball. Wilson was an avid baseball fan, and he went to as many Washington Senators games as he could. But because of his incapacities, because of his ill health, he couldn't navigate the grandstands. He couldn't get up into the bleachers really at all. And so the owner of the team made a special concession for Wilson and allowed his car to park on the field. On the other side of the foul line, of course, never in the field of play. But this way he could watch the game and not have to be embarrassed or inconvenienced in trying to negotiate those often very difficult stairs. To keep the car and the former president safe, the team would also have to post a player on the front bumper to sit there and ensure that Wilson's car didn't get hit by anything. And when they changed the inning, they had to remember to change that guy out too. Now, in 1923, Woodrow Wilson receives a second car as a gift. That is this 1923 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost Oxford touring car. It was a beautiful machine, and quickly became Edith's favorite automobile. And so when Woodrow Wilson dies in February of 1924, Edith now has two automobiles, but only one small garage. And she decides to keep the Rolls. I understand why, and decides to donate the 1919 Pierce Arrow to, at the time, leading citizens of Stanton. This is how the car appeared in 1925 when it first arrives here in the city of Stanton. It is parked in front of the birthplace house, which looked very different back then. A number of architectural elements like this porch, the two-level porch, those were removed in the 1930s when we restored the house to what it looked like in the 1850s. But this gives you a good idea of what it looked like when it first arrived here in town. When Edith donated the car, there was a big to-do, but she also hadn't been using the car for a little while. Again, she preferred the Rolls-Royce. And so she actually had to rent a car battery to get the car down here. And when she left after the donation, she took that battery back to DC with her. It left a little bit of a puzzle for the folks here in town. They had to find a battery pretty quick before they could use it. But they also discovered that Edith had forgotten to leave the keys. Edith arrived back in DC, discovered she still had the keys, and mailed them to them very quickly. This is in Edith's handwriting. This package contains 5 keys to Pierce Arrow limousine car from Mrs. Woodrow Wilson, S Street, Washington, D.C. She had to mail these to Stanton so that they could still operate the car. Now, it took a long time before the Pierce Arrow had a dedicated home, a dedicated gallery, the way that it does now. And indeed, for many years, the car was stored at various places around town. The Birthplace Foundation, as the Presidential Library was called back then, was officially founded in 1938. And it took many years before, again, a dedicated space for the car was created. And so while it was being stored around town, the goal was for people to be able to see it. It was a significant draw. It was a beautiful piece of machinery. And so it was kept at various garages and dealerships around the city. Unfortunately, there were also periods where it did not receive the care that it deserved. At no point in its history was the car completely derelict. But unfortunately, there were times where in the 1930s and 40s, especially, and we can probably guess why based on world events going on at that same time, what little money was coming into the Birthplace Foundation was primarily going to fix up the Birthplace House. And so, unfortunately, there was also a period in the early to mid 1950s where the Pierce Arrow was stored at the Stanton Fairgrounds, now a part of the Gypsy Hill Park here in town. It was stored indoors in a building, but sometimes they needed that building for other things, and the car would be pushed out into the open and left alone for sometimes extended periods of time. It was during that time that, unfortunately, a few pieces from the car were stolen. It's a little hard to see in this image, but the hood ornament there at the very front of the car is no longer the eagle. It is that snarling Princeton tiger that was stolen during this period. Other items that were taken were the carriage lights, one of which you can see right up here between the doors, both of which also went missing around that time. That tiger hood ornament still is lost, but we'll come back to the carriage lights in just a little bit. In the 1950s, the car received, and you can see now it is missing both the tiger and the carriage lights, did find a home here on the site of the now presidential library in our carriage house, a former carriage house here on the property. It received then much better care for sure. It was better protected, and it was much more easily accessible to visitors who came to see it. But that still didn't mean it was always getting the care it required. And in the 1950s, Edith Wilson, widow of Woodrow Wilson, comes to visit. She outlived him by quite a bit. She passes away in 1961, and she was a major force in creating what becomes the Presidential Library. But when Edith visits, they think, this is a great idea. We'll clean up the car, and we'll have a parade in her honor, and she will lead it in her husband's old car. They did clean it up. It looked very nice. It was shiny and well cared for, but they didn't do the same for the engine, unfortunately. And so if you've ever been to Stanton, you know we've got more than a few hills around here. And with Edith in the car in the middle of the parade, this poor automobile stalls and dies at the bottom of one of those hills. Everyone is very embarrassed. Thankfully, the governor of Virginia is in the car directly behind them. Edith pops out and hops into his car, and the parade continues. Though I'm sure the staff at the time, I certainly would have been mortified. This is the first real impetus for significant restoration and more serious care of this automobile. In the 1960s, early 1960s, it is sent to New York City to a restorer in New York, in the Brooklyn area, for a comprehensive evaluation. Unfortunately, at the time, they decide they are unable to provide the care that it will need, the restoration efforts that it will need. And so they bring it back to Stanton to spend some time and raise a little bit more money so that they can really give it the work that it requires. In the early 1970s, the car does get its first true comprehensive restoration. In fact, it's sort of taken apart. The vast majority of the car goes up to an expert restorer in New Hampshire. Other pieces, for instance, like the instrument panel, that is sent to Denver for an expert to restore. It eventually returns to Stanton, and there's been quite a bit of work done since then. But one of the things that was done during the restorations was, because we couldn't find the original carriage lights, replicas were made that grace the car today. But that doesn't mean that the replicas were lost, or excuse me, that the originals were lost forever. In fact, those lamps have been recovered, and this is a photograph from our collection of the actual carriage lights from our Pierce Arrow that were recovered about 15 years ago on eBay, of all places. A local gentleman was selling them. His father had also been a local guy, and according to the description, the seller didn't know exactly what he had. He thought he was just selling some interesting antique car pieces. He said that his father had found them ages ago in a junk sale. That may be true. We also know that his father was a local guy, and that he had been a teenager around the time that those original lights were removed from the car. Statute of limitations being what it is, we certainly weren't going to try to push anything, but we were very happy to get them back. Because the replicas had already been created and installed, and because the manner that these were stolen, they are electric lights, but they were just unscrewed and all the wires were cut. They are significantly tarnished. The decision was made, instead of trying to replace them on the car, instead the replicas stayed, and we keep these in our collection storage as a really interesting and kind of fun, I think, object lesson. It's one of the reasons that I hold out hope that perhaps that Princeton Tiger hood ornament is still out there somewhere and may return to us one day. Now, in the modern day, the Pierce Arrow has really become a symbol of the WWPL, and in some cases, a symbol of Stanton. It's very well known around our city. It is in parades here in town every year for the 4th of July and Veterans Day. It sometimes appears in local car shows even. And in 1980, local group, gospel and country singing group, the Statler Brothers, used it in their 1980 album, Statler Brothers 10th Anniversary, celebrating their 10 years with Mercury Records. Here we have them all in tuxedos, leaning on the car. We don't really encourage people to do that part of it anymore, but we were thrilled that they wanted to include the car in their on their album art. The car has also occasionally been used in filming. In the 20 aughts, the beginning of this century, just about 15-ish years ago, the car was taken down to Richmond, Virginia, to be a part of the filming of the HBO movie Iron-Jawed Angels, all about the suffrage movement, and especially the Silent Sentinels, who picketed outside the White House for more than a year in all weather, trying to push for the right for women to vote, for what would eventually become the 19th Amendment. And the car was taken down to Richmond. You can see it here. This is how they film, especially old cars. Rather than the car itself being driven, it is on a trailer, on a dolly, and the camera is put on the truck before it, allowing them to film and have far more control over the speed and things like that of the car. It remains the oldest still operational presidential car in the country, and we're delighted that it is able to participate in things like this on occasion. And while we're talking briefly about the suffrage movement, we can jump back a little bit. You've seen this photo before of it with its touring body as the Wilsons, as Woodrow and Edith are leaving the White House. But this figure here on the side, by the pillar on the far right side of the image, holding a banner, that is one of those Silent Sentinels. This photograph was taken during that protest. A bit tough to see in these images, but those banners were very colorful. They had messages and slogans on them. They wanted the right to vote, and they were not afraid to stand up to the president. Now, some other fascinating things that the car has done in recent years. As I mentioned, the car was it was in 2008 that the Woodrow Wilson Bridge, the new span of the Woodrow Wilson Bridge, was dedicated, and the car was the first official automobile to make that crossing, again, while holding the governors of Virginia and Maryland, the Secretary of Transportation, and a Virginia senator who had really pushed the legislation through. It has traveled to car shows and events all around the country. In 2014, it was at an event called Cars at the Capitol on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Here we have it outside with the Washington Monument in the back, and here we have it inside in the tent. It was chosen to represent the decade of the 19 teens. There was a car representing every decade going back to the 1890s, and we were thrilled to be chosen to represent the 19 teens. It has also been to car shows in California, in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, in New England, in Florida, and its most recent car show was just before the pandemic in 2019 to celebrate its 100th year. It was invited to the Gasparilla Concours d'Elegance in Tampa, Florida. The minarets of the University of Tampa, you can see in the background, the palm trees on the left-hand side, certainly not something you see much in Stanton, Virginia. But when it goes further afield than, say, Waynesboro, which is kind of the next town over to Stanton, it never drives itself. We don't take it out on the interstate. It could go 60 miles an hour. When it was new, we haven't really gotten it over 40, 45 in a long time. We want to make sure that it keeps running as opposed to really trying to test its limits. And so when it goes long distances, it travels by auto carrier. Because it is more than 8 feet high and more than 16 feet long, it often has to go all by itself in specially designed trailers. Now, the car itself is about 80% original. If you want to keep an antique automobile running, you have to run it, and that means more than a few pieces will get replaced as time goes on. The tires, of course, are not the same as it had in the 19 teens. The light bulbs in the carriage lights or the headlights or the spark plugs, things like that, have got to be replaced if we want to keep the car running. When we have a piece that breaks or that needs to be replaced, we have to sometimes have it made, but also are very lucky that there is a very large and extensive Pierce Arrow Society, groups and individuals who have other Pierce Arrow cars and maintain them, and often have pieces, parts that are available for sale. The car uses normal gasoline. We get unleaded gas. We have to get the kind that doesn't have any ethanol in it. That can gum up the engine, so we keep away from that. But it is otherwise surprisingly, the care of the car is surprisingly modern. Its current condition, and it truly is in amazing, immaculate condition, is largely attributed to Dick Robertson. Dick passed away in 2011, but he had been a part of the Woodrow Wilson Birthplace Foundation and then library family for decades. He had been explicitly invited to help care for this car, and he did so with immense generosity and skill. It is really a tribute to Dick that the car is in such a fantastic condition today. And it's also very much a tribute to him that on July 9th, 2019, we celebrated the car's 100th birthday. It's been an amazing time. We are delighted to have the car. We got it a cake. The car didn't get to have any. I'm sure it was a little upset. But we shared it with a number of our guests there today, just to celebrate this truly immense milestone for this automobile. The Pierce Arrow has been at the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library for decades and decades, longer even than it was, certainly than it was ever owned by Woodrow Wilson, but it remains a crown jewel, and we are so happy to be celebrating another birthday for the car today. We wish it many more, and thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope that we'll see you in person here in Stanton sometime very soon. Thank you so much, and take care.